Hello and a warm welcome to everyone. Uh, my name is Claudia Girardone and I am the Director of Research at Essex Business School and Professor in Banking and Finance. Also welcome from my colleague Suma Athreye, who is Professor of Technology Strategy at the Strategy Operation and Entrepreneurship Group in the Business School. This event is the second in a series co-hosted by us and the Center for Innovation Management Research based at Birkbeck, University of London. We had a first event in March that was exploring the role of public research in the development of the COVID vaccine. And one of the crucial issues that emerged during the debate was the fact that while a vaccine was developed through global scientific collaboration and manufactured quite quickly in less than 1 year, the logistic of the global production and global delivery faced many challenges, particularly in relation to the emerging nationalism. Now, a common refrain is that nobody is safe until everyone is safe, and a question that has been emerging as well is the need of a reformed supranational organization or even a new supranational organization. So we have two speakers today. We are very lucky to have two speakers presenting around these issues as Professor Grazia Ietto-Gillies, who is Emeritus Professor at the London South Bank University in Applied Economics and also Visiting Professor at Birkbeck University of London in the UK, and Klaus Meyer, who is Professor of International Business at the Ivy Business School, Western University, Ontario. I've asked the speakers to take about 15 minutes for the talk, and then each, and then we open the floor to discussion. So we start off with Professor Grazia Ietto-Gillies. Grazia, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. The title of my talk is From Roosevelt to Bolsonaro, 75 Years of Integration and Fragmentation. And I want to start with saying that in the last year and a half or so, we had some triumphs worldwide. Triumphs of science, scientific collaboration, the health profession, and also on the business side, we had the triumph for the organization of production across countries for vaccines. But we also had and still have some very important failures, unfortunately, and the failures are on the politics side at both national and international levels. In 1944, at the opening of the Bretton Woods Conference, President Roosevelt said something like, well, this, economic diseases are highly communicable. It follows, therefore, that the economic health of every country is a proper matter of concern for all its neighbors, near and distant. Now, there are three key elements in this little statement. The first one is that economic systems are highly interdependent, that economic problems are highly and the third one is that countries and governments need to act together at global level to secure growth. why do I mention Roosevelt now? What does it have to do with us? Well, because I think the statement is true today to an even bigger, wider extent. First of all, because the exchanges he was talking about are now much bigger and much wider. They range not only from trade, portfolio investment, but also direct investment and the integration of production processes at world level via the global value chains. Moreover, there is a lot more movement of people, and they move more of them, more of us, and faster. And there is also ease and diversity. So there are these three elements: interconnections, transmissibility, and interdependence. Today, the interdependence of countries depend on the interconnection and the transmissibility in three main areas, not just economics, as what was worrying Roosevelt, but also in the health and the environment. I'll talk about interconnections first. On the economics and business, have effects on the other two elements, types of jobs, transport systems, lifestyle. And then economics and business affects the environment via the energy sources, the food production, and again, the lifestyles. Then we have environment and climate changes which affect economics, because there's a structural infrastructure, crops, products, and lives. And the environment and climate changes also affect the health via pollution, and also many scientists have linked the virus, the current virus, into the poor, unhealthy links between the cities, countryside, and the animal world. And then there is the effects of the pandemic on the economy, directly and via the policies to stop the spread, and on the environment via the impact of lower transport activities and on air pollution. So that's so far for the interconnection, which I think these three elements are very strongly interconnected, and they affect each other in almost kind of multiplication. Then the transmissibility, how they transmit across geographies. Roosevelt told us that economic problems are highly communicable, transmissible across countries. So are viruses, that's what the essence of pandemics, and so are environmental events, which manifest in a variety of ways and geographies. The problems they create are transmissible via economic and health effects, and of course also via migrations. All the two elements, interconnections and transmissibility, lead to stronger and stronger interdependence. And interdependence at this time is not just on the economics, it's also on the other two elements. There is also what I would like to, and this is something which I really feel personally, I think that we are also subject to some kind of psychological interdependence. Events in faraway countries, the forest fires, or children dying on beaches affect us immediately. They're there every evening, we hear about them. Now, the agent of interconnection on the economics side, but not only on the economic side, but so far we've studied them in terms of the business side and the economic side. The main agents are the transnational corporations, and they operate in all three spheres of interconnection: economy, health, environment. On the economy, well, here in this audience, we all know about the activities. 8% of all trade originates with them, global value chains, the investment, and so on. On the healthcare, they are responsible for much care delivery, for the insurance, for the production of equipment, and so on. And regarding climate, well, oil, motor, aviation, food industries, almost a lot. Now, in terms of interconnections, I always feel that actually transnational companies are both agents of integration in the areas which I've just talked about, but they're also agents of fragmentation across the world. They integrate via for direct investment, trade, global value chains, but they fragment the production process across countries. We are seeing at the moment the problem created by the fragmentation of the production process in the case of vaccines. And also they fragment other agents dealing and bargaining with them, particularly labor, governments, suppliers. They each act independently, never together, while a transnational companies act from one single center across many countries, if not the world. Now, I want now to touch on something else. The modern era is what I would call the era of public goods and ills. The 19th and 20th century dominated by smaller, of course the 20th century, they were also very big business, and by the triumph of market economies. I think the last decades we've seen more domination of large tech and brand monopolies, kind of mantra market knows best, and will get us back to equilibrium if we are outside it, to the idea that we have to accept that now we are in a world of public goods and public ills. What are they? Public goods are goods which are non-rival in use. I can use a good, a bridge at almost no extra cost for anybody else. Or defense of the country, I can use it at almost no extra cost to anybody else. Now, they are a special category of goods for which the usual rules of economics don't seem to apply. And even orthodox economics recognize that the state has to intervene when we deal in public goods. Now, public ills is the same, but of course negative. If a bad environment affects not just me, but everybody else. The pandemic is absolutely clear that if I get it, other people will get it. Now, where are we on the politics of the pandemic? I mean, I just quote things which are around in the media. Nobody's safe unless everyone is safe. We had over 3 million dead so far and counting. We have, from a title of our webinar today, Vaccine Nationalism. Gordon Brown talks of vaccine apartheid. Mr. Bolsonaro claims that COVID-19 is just a little flu. And however, if the new variants are developed in Brazil or in India or in Britain, as they have, then this affects everybody else. So what can we do? What can we do? In reality, we have fragmented politics in both health and environment. too little coordination for strategies specific to the pandemic. We have coordination on the production level, at the level of transnational corporations, but they don't deal and they can't deal with the public goods. For public goods or ills, we need something different. The other point actually which I want to add is that the pandemic is only too often used to bolster nationalism in what at times appears almost a playground banter. We shall soon have a world-beating track and trace system. And then it turns out what was world-beating is the cost, actually, not the effectiveness. And then we hear our vaccine is better than somebody else's vaccine. The Russians actually called it Sputnik to lead us decades ago. So it's almost childish the way things are going. Now, the two main public ills of today are global. They're not national, they're not regional, they're global. They create and transmit problems at global level. Now, even the neoclassical theory accepts that public goods and ills need government intervention. We have plenty of intervention on the production side of private products, plenty of intervention, but not enough on the way of production or delivery and dealing in general with the public goods or public ills. We have no appropriate governance to deal with the public ills. What sort of governance are we likely to need? I think we need a supranational institution for both health and environment. Institutions that are trusted, representative, long-term, and therefore independent of current politicians looking for the next results at the next election. Now, in the case of the pandemic, what would I expect from now, most scientists tell us that we will have more pandemics. It's not clear when, but they're sure we will. So we need the detection power, and detection power cannot be just in 3 or maybe 10 developed countries of the world. It's got to be everywhere. And all of us have to pay for that infrastructure in every single country, both equipment and human infrastructure. Then we need containment. And for this, we need to build somehow some consensus at the international level. And there where I see a supranational institution having a big role. And then suppression, that here we go, which I think we need to start thinking of production at supranational level and maybe doing away with the patents, just not for all the drugs, but for the vaccines. And certainly no way that we can deal with the pandemic if we have a vaccine apartheid. Is this utopia? Yes, perhaps. But I feel, very often I feel that unless we start thinking big, we are unlikely to achieve anything, even little. So, Mr. Roosevelt, please come back, and if you can, I wrote to neutralize, but I have to say to you that I had used stronger terms to begin with, but I thought I would tone it down a bit, because I feel that actually somehow the politics in one country, including Britain, of course, affect everybody else. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grazia, for this great presentation. I think it's been a bit abrupt to how we started, but you managed well to present all points that you wanted to make. So thank you very much. I suggest we move on, given time constraints, to the next speaker, so that we see now another set of view, and then we open the debate for the audience. Klaus, are you ready to share, please?
Hello, good morning, everyone. Greetings from Canada. I'm happy to contribute to this debate, and what I have prepared sort of complements Grazia's perspective very well, because Grazia was focusing very much on the abstract and the historical perspective, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the specific institutions at play in the current environment, and trying how we can try and make sense of it, or how I'm trying to make sense of it, and then hopefully we have a discussion. So this is the baseline. We all, in theory, agree that the world needs to be vaccinated, but the progress has been very uneven. The UK is racing ahead of all other major economies. There are some smaller countries that have even higher rates. If you look at people fully vaccinated, the US is actually ahead. EU and Canada are sort of middling, much slower to get going. Emerging markets like Brazil and India have started, other emerging markets haven't started at all. And that's really the fundamental issue that we're concerned about. Now, just my starting point, I believe most people here in the audience come more from the public policy perspective. My area is international business, and I teach international business. One of the cases that I teach is a Novo Nordisk case, which is focused on clinical trials. I've been teaching this case with EMBA, MBA sort of audiences for 12 years. And so just some basic learning points that come out of this discussion again and again. Ethical issues in the pharma industry are very complex. And even though this discussion is only about clinical trials, it's already very complex. And communicating that to external stakeholders, such as journalists, is even more complex. So usually the case discussion ends with a role play. Although next week, when I teach the case again, this role play will look a little bit different because it's done on Zoom. The clinical trials are normally run globally. And there are lots of reasons for that. And it's not the reasons that the journalists suspect. It's about cost. Yes, that matters, but there are also ethical reasons, regulatory reasons, also scientific reasons, because we want to have a valid vaccine. The purpose of the trial process is to identify rare side effects and inform users of the vaccination appropriately, prevent really big scandals that happened in the historically. Even you have to go several decades ago for the really big scandals, because medications went to market before we knew they're really safe, right? So it's about effectiveness. Does it actually do what it promises to do, and identification of side effects? And you need, as a pharma company, you need to provide those data for the regulatory approval, and that's where huge costs come in the pharma industry. So once you introduce a vaccine or any other medication, you have huge sunk cost. Also take in consideration, not everything actually works. So that's the first point to make. The second question is, if you think back of the graph that I've shown you earlier, how come the UK is ahead of EU in terms of building vaccination in the population? There are two sets of arguments that are being discussed in the, let's say, qualified media, not the tabloids, but the people who really dig into these things deeper and analytically. One argument is the UK actually set up a task force already in April that was concerned not just about research and development, but building the supply chain, making sure that once we have the vaccine approved, we can actually produce it, including investments in manufacturing facilities in the UK itself. Okay, and it was a case of active and successful industrial policy, which is not what the UK usually is known for, but they seem to have done that well. And the second set of reasons has to do with the way contracts were drawn up. the EU and Canada also have lots of contracts, but the contracts that the UK or US did with the pharma companies were drawn up in a way that meant that the US and the UK were first in line when the vaccine actually became available. And that is, of course, in return for having paid money early on in terms of supporting the research. So those are the two key issues that bring the US and the UK ahead in terms of actually rolling out the vaccine starting December, January this year. Oops. Now, the main discussion I'd like to have now, what's the role of institutions in this set? And I'm want to focus on the supranational institutions, where we have some institutions in the area of trade. It's mainly the World Trade Organization and its constituent parts, of which TRIPS, the trade-related intellectual property rights set of rules, is the most relevant here. And then we have a different player, which is the World Health Organization, which has a different agenda, which is concerned with promoting public health around the world, which has its own set of associated institutions that they work with. It's actually a very small organization. We often overestimate their work. And these institutions interact, of course, with what's happening on a national level in terms of regulation, the healthcare, trade barriers, etc. Just start with a national one. Usually we start with tariffs. Tariffs is actually not a big issue in this context. Right? Most countries don't have tariffs on the import of vaccines. There's some countries that have some tariffs on some of the components, which is not a very smart thing to do. But this is not something of major concern and discussion. Export constraints have become an issue. Normally, when we talk about international trade, export constraints is not top of the agenda because they're very rare. However, Canada experienced what it means to be dependent on another country back in April when Donald Trump suddenly banned American producers from exporting face masks, and suddenly we didn't get any, even though Canadian government had contracted some. Of course, the volumes were too small. Worldwide production was too small relative to what was worldwide needed. Everybody blamed those who are able, producing them, which was mainly in China, but no matter where the production is an issue of increasing production. But if we think about the prohibition or barriers to exports, there are some countries that have formal barriers. But if you look at the US and the UK, they don't have a formal barrier to exports, but they actually contracted all the domestic suppliers from their national health organization. Therefore, de facto, they're not exporting either. So I call this informal. Not sure that's the right word. Maybe you should call it through contracting. But then if you look at China and Russia, the data are actually not really transparent. China is exporting to a number of developing countries. That's nice, but the data are not transparent. So the data I have here made it also various sources on the internet. I go back to a consultancy called Affinity. Gina Kopinat used that, who is someone I presume is competent and checks the reliability of what she says. She's the chief economist at the IMF after all. Okay, so that's national institutions that come into play. So internationally, there was already in November an initiative to say we don't want export restrictions. The EU was part of that, as was Canada. But as you can see, nevertheless, this is only a symbolical thing, non-binding, and it hasn't prevented the issue. Now, TRIPS. Now it gets tricky. I think Suma knows much more about TRIPS than I do. So let me just basically say TRIPS establishes the basic principle that countries have to follow when they trade in products that contain intellectual property owned by someone else. Okay. The critical thing, and that's what's causing a big debate now, is the compulsory licensing. Principally, countries can use compulsory licensing if they have a national emergency. That compulsory licensing basically means you produce the product, or a company in your own country produces a medication, let's say, and the government decides how much license fee you pay to the owner of the IP. and that's final, right? So that's the the owner of the IP doesn't get to negotiate the license fee, which often would imply that the license fee is so high that in developing countries can't afford it. Also, it means that the whole process is delayed because there's a lot of negotiation going on and so on. So compulsory licensing seems to be a good way for allowing developing countries handling national emergencies, especially in the medical area. The issue is it doesn't work in practice. And I specifically refer to the paper in JIBP by Urias and Ramani. That's a special issue that Suma has co-edited. My understanding is that the issue is that countries like India, who have the capability to produce medications, companies are reluctant to operate under compulsory license because they come under pressure from their business partners as well as national governments in those countries that actually own the IP. So medical companies in India need to be on the positive side of the key players in the global industry for their normal business. Therefore, they're a little bit reluctant to get involved. It gets even more complex if we look at countries, let's say, randomly pick a country, let's say Nigeria. They don't have domestic capacity to produce many medications or vaccines. So they would have to import under compulsory license from another country. And to make that happen is hugely complex and requires both governments of both countries to enact certain legal measures to enable compulsory licensing. And if they do that, now I have here a quote from Joe Stiglitz of Financial Times a few days ago. He says, historically, US have always threatened countries that have used it. It here refers to compulsory licensing. So we've agreed to it, but we undermine it. We here refers to United States, right? So there's enormous pressure for countries on a political level not to use compulsory licensing. And as Urias and Ramani show in their paper, it virtually never happens, with very few exceptions. Now, would it be a good idea to have a patent waiver? Grazia also alluded to that. Now, the argument from the pharma industry is that even if you have the patent waiver, it may not work, right? Because especially for vaccines and the more cutting edge technologies there, it's biological process that you have to be built over time and that require a lot of tacit knowledge and also knowledge about the process that is not in a patent. So if it give you the patent, you can use it, it still doesn't enable really you to do it unless you have highly qualified manufacturers in the country. And the second argument refers to quality control, because if someone produces your vaccine and does a bad job and there are consequences, there are some people in some countries taking vaccine A, and suddenly there are huge side effects from that. That could have reputation effects on the vaccine A globally, right? That's another thing the pharmaceutical industry would be, or the IP holder rights holders would be very concerned about. And finally, the pharma industry wants what they call a fair return on their high-risk investments. They don't emphasize that so much in the public debate, but obviously that is a major motivation. And what is a fair return on a high-risk investment is obviously also debated. Also the question whether developing vaccines under the conditions of active government support and government actually funding part of the research or already doing purchasing contracts while it's still under development actually reduces the risk considerably, so the return rates may not, there are obviously lots of debates. There are a lot of people who get involved in these discussions. There was, again, a few days in the FT, there was they reported an open letter by lots of VIPs who say that we need a W2 waiver on IP rights. And developing countries, especially India and South Africa, argue that they have the technical competences, the manufacturing competences to produce these vaccines. Okay, so that's where I think this debate stands. At this time, I see it as an open-ended debate.
Thank you very much. Oh, sorry, I thought you.
Sorry, you stopped me when I ran out of time.
Yeah, sorry. No, I just wanted to say that we need to check time if we want a bit of debate. So if you could wrap up, please.
Okay. So I skipped the CTAP, which is something that WHO started last summer. The key scheme that has been developed is a COVAX scheme, which basically means that it is sponsored by the WHO and some other institutions. The idea here is pooled negotiations with the vaccine rights holders. That means increases the bargaining power of the developing countries in a way. The COVAX is funded by advanced economies, and also there is a subsidy element in here. So the idea is that IP rights holders retain all the rights, and developing countries are helped simply by pooling bargaining power. The problem is COVAX is competing with national health organizations directly sourcing and having bilateral negotiations, like the examples I mentioned. All the advanced economies negotiate directly with IP rights holders, and therefore in a way compete with COVAX when it comes to what price IP rights holders can hold. That's the challenge there. Let me try to, since you asked me to round up, we can talk more about COVAX and where they stand. So thinking about all these issues, how can we move forward? Now, Grazia was making suggestions for very fundamental issues of realigning the institutional architecture internationally with respect to medical issues in general to prevent future pandemics. So based on my digging through all these issues, I think there are two issues that we should do urgently within existing structures. And one is to address the issue of compulsory licensing, which is exceedingly complex. So I agree with Joe Stiglitz here that that is something we should address, and by simplifying the rules. And the other issue is IP rights is not just for final products, but also various data that are sort of in the process. And one thing that puzzles me in particular is that clinical trial data that companies submit when they apply for FDA or EMA or whatever the British equivalent is to that. They have to submit them to the regulators, but it's still considered confidential. And whoever wants to do future research either doesn't have access or certainly can't use them for their own submissions of generica, for example. So I think that is an area where we might tweak IP rights. These are both ideas that could be implemented within the existing institutional infrastructure without sort of throwing out everything we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Klaus, for this very interesting presentation. Sorry, I need to be aware of time because we want to give the opportunity to the audience to contribute to this debate. I think the two speakers, both Grazia and yourself, have highlighted really important issues. One of these is, I mean, Grazia seems to be really pointing to the need for this new supranational institution for the health and environmental areas. Also because new pandemics are expected by scientists. So this is something that needs to be addressed, as we don't have appropriate governance to deal with this, what she calls public ill. And then the fact that you pointed out really important on compulsory licensing in developing countries. I think I put it here in the slides, nobody's safe until everyone is safe. I think this is really a refrain that summarizes the issues, and we all mostly agree with that. Now, Suma, I see you put in the chat a point about this compulsory licensing, particularly in relation to the whether the tacit technology know-how will be transferred. So you may get a license, but still not be able to actually produce. I guess this is the case in some of the countries of the developing world. So do you want to add anything, Suma, to this?
Yeah, thanks. I want to add actually two things. One is that Grazia's view seems to be more a medium-term view, that, you know, we need to establish institutions that will deal with, if you like, negative externalities, such as in the areas of health and climate. And there may be, you know, there may be commonalities across these two areas. But on the but Klaus's point is more, and actually I agree with it, is that we need reform of existing institutions that's been quite long overdue. So we've had this debate before about compulsory licensing and patents in the context of HIV drugs. So, you know, the issue is always that in compulsory licensing, there is...
Suma, sorry to interrupt you. I can't hear you very well.
No.
Can you be closer to the microphone?
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay.
Thank you.
So the issue in compulsory licensing has always been that the know-how, it's up to the manufacturers to transfer it. And there is no compulsion that they have to transfer it. So in the case of HIV drugs, Indian generic manufacturers were able to reverse engineer. In the case of biologics, it's not quite clear because you know, it's a much more complicated process. But on the other hand, it's closer to laboratory science, so maybe with clinical trial data they can. But this reform is long overdue in the health sector. There have been a lot of studies that have shown that compulsory licensing ought to be available more freely to emerging economies who have health emergencies, and this might be a good time to do that. It also probably applies to climate change technologies, but that's another discussion. So my sort of summary is that, you know, the need for a new institution is a medium term. It needs a lot of negotiations between countries, a little bit in the way that the UN was established on the, if you like, the ashes of the League of Nations. It took a long time for it to come up again. But what we can do with the existing supranational institutions is maybe to reform them. The second point I'd like to make is that there's a very interesting way in which the WTO has ended up acting in the interests of vaccine producers. And the WHO acts in the interest of vaccine consumers. But it really, the vaccine consumers have no way to compel the producers to do anything. So the WHO doesn't have any way to compel the WTO. And you can see that in Klaus didn't put up the CTAP slides, but the CTAP was a patent pooling idea of the WHO, and it has not got even a single patent delivered to it, not even the publicly funded patents. So that's two things to put on the table. I mean, there are people in this audience more knowledgeable than me.
Okay, I put CTAP on the table.
Can I?
Grazia. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Yes. Well, I think you're right, Suma. Yes, what I said in the last couple of slides applies to the medium to longer term. Regarding I also agree with you about the separation of responsibility or tasks by WTO and the WHO, but this is part of the problem. Essentially, there is no single institution which deals with the whole problem, seen from, you know, how it hits the people who get the infections. And on top of that, actually, particularly WHO, it does not have much power. It can recommend that politicians control a gathering of people, but we just recently saw what happened in India, or they can recommend things, but they cannot do anything else. They don't have power. And this is, I think, part of the problem. You see, I mean, what I was trying to say is that we have now entered a new game, a game in which the environment and also the pandemic or pandemics can actually put the whole of all the countries and all the people in a different position to what it was 50 years ago. I think, I hope that it is a kind of wake-up call.
Thank you, Grazia. Klaus, do you want to add anything to this?
No, I don't think. Let's
Okay.
get some questions from the audience, and then we can discuss further.
We can people, if the audience, if you want to
Yeah.
raise your hand.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello. My name is Miriam Montano, and I'm a first-year undergraduate at sociology in Essex. And right now I'm doing a journal on bureaucracy and medical development. My focus right now is the development of the COVID-19 vaccine. So because this was an international crisis, we can see some governments have reduced the bureaucracy in the institutions that are involved in producing and distributing the vaccine. And there has also been a cut in bureaucratic steps on the international level, as we have seen. And the result is that today, after only 1 year, we have many efficient available vaccines. So my question I like to ask the speakers, do you think that this situation is a sign that typically the regulatory measures in medical research are excessive and harmful for advancement, or do you think that proper quality control is sort of dependent upon very strict regulations and that bureaucratic complications are somehow inevitable?
Thank you very much. So Klaus, yes.
Yeah, to answer that, I'd like to go back to my second slide. Normally, vaccine development takes a very, very long time because companies need to go through several stages of developing and testing the vaccine. And they need to have one stage completed before they can move on to the next one, and regulators make sure, for avoiding risks, really, to make sure that you have completed one stage before moving on to the next stage. And each stage takes a lot of time because it takes a while to enroll volunteers, and getting volunteers takes a long time. This, because of the emergency situation, everybody has been a little bit more flexible. Clinical trials protocols have been simplified. Enrollment of volunteers has been accelerated. A lot of the trials have taken place in emerging markets. I mean, to actually test the efficacy of a drug, you can't test it in China because they don't have much COVID around. So the Chinese companies went to Brazil and the Middle East, and where else did they test it? But also the big US-based companies. Trials are run out of globally. So there have been simplifications in trial protocols. Things have been done remotely, and that's why they have been able to accelerate it. Because the fact that there was a lot of funding thrown in, including private money and public money, i.e. government sponsorship, also helped accelerating that process. But I think your question is, why is it so complicated, right? If that's your main question, my answer is, if you get a vaccine wrong or a medication, it can have enormous consequences. So In my classes, I usually give the thalidomide example, which was a medication that was used in the early 1960s. And you may have met people that are a little bit older than myself who don't have arms or legs, right? And that's because their mothers, while during pregnancy, took this medication called thalidomide. And that's a case of things hadn't been tested on the relevant population, specifically pregnant women. And that type of scandals led to a very complex regulation that is underlying the approval of medications by the FDA in the US, the European Medicines Association, and other corresponding associations around the world. Does that sort of help answer the question?
Thank you very much.
Can I
Thank you.
just
Yes,
add
please.
to what Klaus said, that in our last debate, there was a person who made this point that somehow during this crisis of COVID, some countries have suspended the precautionary principle, which has governed a lot of the regulation of medicine, and others have not. And so, you know, we have a really nice natural experiment. The UK has suspended the precautionary principle, the EU has not. So there are short-term consequences and long-term consequences. I'm thinking about the precautionary principle as contributing to bureaucracy. So that's something you may want to look at, Miriam. I mean, I'd be very happy to discuss it with you offline.
Yes, I think that's right. So when there was evidence of blood clots in very rare examples, the medical regulators in some countries said that we need to examine, therefore we temporarily stop it. Right, that's an example of precautionary principle. The the UK has been more pragmatic on those and hasn't done that. The advantage is that there seems to be less confusion about the safety of the AstraZeneca medication, but the evidence is still out that in very rare cases it can have these certain negative effects that are not yet well understood. Right, that's the issue.
Thank you very much for the question and the answers. Let's see, Muthu, you have raised your hand, and then Nicola. Muthu,
Yeah, thank you very much, Claudia, and also thank you very much, Klaus and Grazia, for the excellent presentations, as well as the audience for the excellent questions and responses. So I was just wondering, while it is, I mean, in theory, it sounds really great to have a supranational organization who may have the power to balance the world. Yes, in theory, that's great in medium or in the long run. But then in practice, how feasible it is, and second, how efficient that kind of organization could be, because on one hand, in a crisis environment, we need an organization that could act efficiently. We know how difficult it is even to make a decision within our, let's say, sometimes even within our own institution. And like it takes time. So, and we are talking about the kind of the world-led organization, so how efficient it could be. And second, we were talking about, the differences in terms of the decisions different countries are making. Like the one example we have just discussed is the regulation, like regulatory heterogeneity. So, for example, some countries decided to not to proceed with the AstraZeneca vaccine because of blood clot cases. The level of risk assessments made by countries were different. So, in that kind of political heterogeneity, how practical it is for an organization, supranational organization, to run efficiently and effectively during a pandemic or during a crisis in general. So I would like to raise that question.
Grazia, do you want to?
Well, thank you very much. Yes, I think you are right. Of course, there are great worries about, and also, I mean, necessarily, it's not that a supranational organization is necessarily sort of always following the interest of the people down on the ground. But on the other hand, what I was trying to say is that we do need someone to coordinate with some teeth, not just say, well, don't have gatherings, but there must be some sanctions if then the things don't work out. Because, as I say, you know, okay, you have gatherings in Cheltenham last year, or in India because of the elections or whatever, and other people carry the consequences. So I mean, I take your point, and I think you're right, and it is very, very, very difficult. But on the other hand, whatever type of government you have on top, which is above everybody, the regions or above, you know, there are problems. Yeah, I haven't, you know, I really don't have any better answer than this, to say that I am aware of the problems, but I'm also aware that we need a bit more than what we have now.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grazia.
Thank you, Grazia.
Well,
Okay,
well, my interpretation of what Grazia was arguing at the end is that we basically should seek to strengthen the WHO and extend the scope of their responsibility, but also make more resources available to them. That would be the natural way to go. The key issue with supranational institutions and WHO in particular is that countries are, and especially the US, are reluctant to delegate any authority to them. Okay, and therefore the WHO cannot overrule what countries do nationally, and changing international institutional architecture in such a way that certain things can be decided by majority as opposed to everybody having a veto is something that there are good reasons why it would be desirable, but there's absolutely no way that any US administration or Congress, who have to approve international treaties after all, would give international institutions any power to overrule what they consider the only legitimate institutions that to run the world is either, or at least to rule their own country, is the elected representatives, i.e. the president and the Senate and the House of Representatives of the US, right? They're not going to delegate any authority to a supranational institution if it means they suddenly can't do certain things. And that's what I think is a fundamental problem. Smaller countries with less bargaining power, you can tweak them in. Maybe China less now than in the past, so they're also becoming more adverse to that. But I think that's the key constraint on developing a really effective, more encompassing, more powerful institution to take on those roles that Grazia developed should be taken.
Yes, can I just say something? I agree with Klaus. I think you're right. But on the other hand, the institutional structure did change after the Second World War, where you can say, all right, it took maybe a big war and all that upheaval, and maybe we're not there. But I hope it's not going to take another very big upheaval, maybe a really big environmental disaster for things to sort of, for us to look into this. I don't know, I hope not.
Well, we all hope not, Grazia. That would be terrible. So I'm aware of time. If people have to leave, I understand. But there is one raised hand, and I would like to give the opportunity to Nicola to ask this one last question. So Nicola,
thank you, Claudia.
Yeah.
So my question is speaking to the institutions. So this is both to Grazia and Klaus. Is my internet bad?
No, it's fine.
Okay, sorry, it's been cutting out.
I can't hear. Could we have maybe in the chat?
As well?
Yeah, as well.
Would you prefer I type it? I'll just type it.
Just say it, but also type it.
Okay, I'll type it afterwards. So so companies are very clever, governments are very clever. What I suspect we're going to see is what's been happening already, in that particularly American companies have been switching their patent strategies to trade secrecy strategies. And there's been a global expansion of trade secrecy protection. So we talked about the know-how, and Klaus, you mentioned the confidentiality of clinical data. So, what are we going to? There isn't a basis that I'm aware of for compulsory licensing of trade secrecy and confidential information. So, is that something that we should look towards doing? Is trying to get that confidential information as part of these compulsory licenses? And B, what do we do anticipating that the control might shift to a trade secrecy strategy? And I'll type that up now.
So, Klaus.
Claudia, I'm afraid I cannot answer any of it because I could not understand. I mean, the sound came to me very muffled, and I'm afraid I haven't been able to capture what was said. I'm sorry, Nicola.
From the issue of trade secrets, I'm not really sure about how it plays on the medical sector. This is something I have to think about. I have been in other discussions with multinationals, especially when you work in China, where a country where IP protection is always an issue. The European companies, Western companies that compete in China, they say, well, our competitive advantage is really in tacit knowledge. And I'm not talking companies other than medical, okay? Our advantages in coming up with new products and in a timely fashion and so on. Patents are not really what we rely on, okay? Because if we put out a patent, we put the information public domain, then the local company can just reverse engineer and invent something around the patent, go around it, right? So the patent, but however, the pharmaceutical industry is quite different because of the long approval process. So you take out the patent when the product enters the clinical trial process. And because the clinical trial process takes a long time, you need that protection, and also the thing that you're actually introducing in the market has to be exactly as specified in the eventually approved product specification. So the role of patents and trade secrets is different in the medical industry than in I don't know, automotive, machine building, those sort of industries that I've dealt, or information technology for that matter, that I've dealt with in the past. I know that doesn't answer the question, but I have to think, I haven't really have an answer on the role of trade secrets. I mean, Suma was referring to it indirectly when she talked about tacit knowledge, the production-related knowledge that you need to develop biologics. And that's in the people and in the organization. It's not on paper. So how do you transfer that? That's I don't have an answer to that. I don't have a solution to that.
Thank you, Klaus. Suma, do you want to add anything? We can't hear you. Suma, are you muted? Oh. No, we can't hear you.
Are you talking to me, Claudia?
No, Grazia. I was talking to Suma. For you, the question has been rephrased in the chat.
Yes, I've seen it. I don't really have anything to add over what Klaus has said, actually. I don't really know. I'm sorry about this.
It's a very specific question. Suma, I'm a bit worried because I can't hear you, so you need to check your connection of the microphone, perhaps physically, the wiring. That could be. Okay, so I think I hope if Suma cannot get back No, we can't hear you. If someone cannot get back with the comments, I suggest we now thank the speakers and give a round of applause virtually. Thank you very much. We were very lucky to
Grazia,
have two
Klaus.
eminent speakers.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you. Very fascinating. Yeah.
And I think there is a lot of food for thought from this event, and I'm sure Suma and Muthu will be in touch later on. We are hoping to carry on with this series. I suggest Muthu, do you want to also give a note of thanks at this point?
Thank you very much, Claudia. So the first, thank you so much, Klaus and Grazia. Super excited comments and discussions and opening up the debate, and it has been fascinating. Thank you so much. And also Claudia and Suma, we are really grateful to you for organizing the debate from your end. And then this is like kind of organically evolving. So we started something and then it looks like there's a lot of interest. So thank you very much, both of you, for organizing this event, and the audience, the participating in this event, and also asking really interesting questions and offering us a lot of food for thoughts. And finally, as Claudia also said, we are hoping to have another session being organized, something around mission-oriented policies. What can we learn from our experience of the rapid vaccine development innovation? But we haven't confirmed it yet, but we are working on it. So as soon as it is confirmed, we will let you know. And again, thank you very much. Yeah, it's such a great session, and have a lovely evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
The recording will be available on YouTube. Okay, so we'll send the link.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.